In 1789, France was collapsing. The government was bankrupt after spending heavily on wars, including its support for the American Revolution. Food prices had soared, and the common people, who made up 98% of the population, were struggling to afford even basic necessities. Meanwhile, the nobility and the monarchy continued to live in luxury, exempt from most taxes. On July 14, 1789, a crowd of revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress that had become a symbol of royal authority. They overpowered its guards, freed a handful of prisoners, and seized its weapons. This event marked the beginning of the French Revolution. In the months that followed, revolutionaries dismantled the monarchy's power. By 1791, King Louis XVI was forced to accept a constitutional monarchy, but tensions remained high. In June 1791, the king and his family tried to escape France in disguise. They were captured and brought back to Paris, where trust in the monarchy collapsed. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. The revolutionaries were afraid that foreign armies would restore the king's power, so they abolished the monarchy in 1792 and declared France a republic. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and removed from power permanently. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, faced the same fate later that year. The revolution then entered its most intense phase. In 1793, the Reign of Terror began, led by the radical Jacobean leader Maximilien Robespierre. The revolutionary government arrested and punished thousands of suspected enemies of the revolution. Over 16,000 people were officially sentenced to severe consequences, while tens of thousands more were imprisoned. By 1794, Robespierre himself was overthrown and faced the same fate, bringing the Reign of Terror to an end. But the chaos was far from over. France's revolutionary wars expanded across Europe, and political instability continued. Finally, in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power, ending the revolution and establishing himself as ruler. By the early 20th century, the Russian Empire was coming apart. The country had been at war for years. Food supplies were running low, and millions of people were struggling just to survive. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas II and the royal family lived in luxury, isolated from the suffering of the people. Frustration was growing, and soon it would reach a breaking point. In February 1917, protests erupt in Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg, over food shortages. Workers walked off the job, soldiers refused orders, and within days, the Russian government collapsed. Nicholas II was forced to step down. A temporary government took over, but it struggled to control the country. As the months passed, the situation worsened. The economy was in crisis, soldiers were deserting the army, and political factions were fighting over power. In October 1917, a radical group called the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, took control. They removed the temporary government and established a new system, promising peace, land, and bread to the people. What followed was one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history. A brutal civil conflict broke out between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and their opponents, the Whites, who wanted to restore the old system. Fighting spread across the country, and millions of civilians were caught in the middle. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had won, and Lenin established the Soviet Union. The monarchy was gone, and Russia had become a communist state. By the 1940s, China was a battleground. Decades of war, economic collapse, and political corruption had left the country in ruins. For years, two rival forces had been locked in a struggle for control: the nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communist movement, led by Mao Zedong. The outcome of their fight would determine the future of the world's most populous country. The roots of the conflict stretched back to the 1920s, but things escalated after World War II. The nationalists, backed by the United States, controlled the cities, industries, and government institutions. The communists, however, had built a powerful base among the rural population, promising land redistribution and the end to feudal oppression. They mastered guerrilla warfare, striking quickly and retreating before larger nationalist forces could respond. By 1946, the two sides were in an all-out civil war. Despite having more soldiers and foreign aid, the nationalists were losing public trust. Inflation made basic goods unaffordable. Famine swept through rural areas, and government officials were accused of hoarding supplies. Meanwhile, the Communist Army, known as the People's Liberation Army, PLA, moved quickly, capturing key cities. They gained control of Manchuria and secured weapons left behind by the Japanese, giving them a major advantage. By 1949, Beijing fell without resistance. Chiang Kai-shek and his remaining forces retreated to Taiwan, effectively ending the war. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and announced the creation of the People's Republic of China. At the end of the 18th century, Haiti was the wealthiest colony in the world, who produced nearly half of the sugar and coffee consumed in Europe. But this prosperity came at a brutal cost. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were forced to work under horrific conditions. In 1971, after years of suffering and oppression, they did something no enslaved people had ever done before. They launched a revolution that would defeat the world's strongest armies and create the first free Black Republic. It started in 1791, when thousands of enslaved workers rose up in a coordinated attack. They set plantations on fire and executed slave owners. Within weeks, more than 100,000 had joined the rebellion, overwhelming the colonial authorities. France, which controlled Haiti, then called Saint-Domingue, sent troops to crush the uprising. But the rebels refused to back down. Their leader, Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, proved to be a brilliant military strategist. Then came an unexpected turn. In 1794, France officially abolished slavery throughout its territories. Louverture allied with the French against the Spanish and British, who had both invaded the colony hoping to take control. By 1801, he had driven out foreign forces and declared himself governor for life. But France's leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, had no intention of letting the colony slip away. Napoleon sent an army of 40,000 soldiers to reclaim the colony. The French captured Louverture and sent him to France, where he lived the rest of his days in prison. But rather than breaking the revolution, this only made the resistance stronger. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, one of Louverture's top generals, took command. By 1803, French troops were being slaughtered by the thousands, not just in battle, but also from yellow fever. Facing heavy losses, Napoleon abandoned his plan. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared Haiti's independence, making it the first nation founded by formerly enslaved people. In the 1850s, China came dangerously close to total collapse. A rebel army stormed across the country, seizing cities and declaring a new kingdom. For over a decade, they waged war against the ruling Qing dynasty, leaving tens of millions of casualties in one of the most destructive conflicts in history. At the center of it all was Hong Xiuquan, a failed scholar from southern China. After repeatedly failing the imperial exams, which was the only path to social mobility for commoners, Hong had a vision that convinced him he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He declared himself the leader of a new movement, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. His mission? To overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a utopian society free from corruption, inequality, and traditional Chinese beliefs. At first, few took him seriously, but by 1850, his followers numbered in the tens of thousands. The movement spread like wildfire, fueled by resentment toward the Qing government. By 1853, the Taiping forces had captured Nanjing, one of China's most important cities, and declared it the capital of their new kingdom. For a time, the Qing dynasty appeared doomed. The imperial army had been weakened by decades of mismanagement and recent defeats in the Opium Wars against Britain, and struggled to contain the rebellion. But cracks began to form within the Taiping leadership. Internal power struggles, corruption, and brutal purges weakened their control. As the rebellion dragged on, their enemies regrouped. The Qing dynasty had help from European forces and powerful local warlords, so they launched a brutal counteroffensive. By 1864, Nanjing was under siege. When Qing forces finally broke through, they devastated the city. Hong Xiuquan had passed away just weeks earlier, reportedly from food poisoning or possibly taking his own life. His remaining followers were hunted down, and the Taiping dream of a new kingdom was crushed. In the late 1970s, one of the Middle East's most powerful nations was turned upside down. What had once been a monarchy backed by the West became an Islamic republic, ruled by religious leaders with absolute authority. For decades, Iran had been ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a pro-Western monarch who sought to modernize the country. His government, supported by the United States and Britain, pushed for industrial growth and education reforms. But while Iran's economy was booming, millions felt left behind. The Shah's rule was seen as corrupt and oppressive. His secret police, Savak, cracked down on opponents, and religious leaders saw his policies as a threat to traditional values. One of the Shah's biggest critics was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious leader exiled for speaking out against him. From abroad, Khomeini's influence grew. He urged Iranians to resist, and by the late 1970s, protests turned into riots, strikes shut down businesses, and soldiers defected. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran. Weeks later, Khomeini returned to a hero's welcome. His supporters quickly took control, overthrowing the remaining government officials. By April, Iran had become an Islamic republic, with Khomeini as supreme leader. The new rulers implemented strict religious laws and cut ties with the West. In 1936, Spain erupted into one of the most brutal civil wars of the 20th century. It was a battle for political ideologies, social classes, and the future of the country. Over the next 3 years, families, neighbors, and entire communities turned against each other in a war that would leave Spain permanently scarred. At the heart of the conflict were two opposing factions: the Republicans, who supported a democratic government, and the Nationalists, a right-wing coalition led by General Francisco Franco. The Republicans included workers, socialists, and communists, while the Nationalists were backed by the military, landowners, and conservatives. Both sides saw the war as a fight for survival, and neither was willing to back down. The war quickly became an international battleground. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy sent troops, weapons, and planes to support Franco, while the Soviet Union provided aid to the Republicans. Thousands of volunteers from around the world joined the fight, forming the international brigades to defend the Republic. Meanwhile, Britain, France, and the U.S. stayed neutral, in fear that the war would spread across Europe. Cities became battlegrounds. Madrid and Barcelona were bombed, and entire villages were wiped out. One of the war's darkest moments came in 1937, when German and Italian warplanes bombed the town of Guernica, taking out hundreds of people. The attack was later immortalized in Pablo Picasso's famous painting. By 1939, Franco's forces had won. The Republicans, weakened by internal divisions and dwindling resources, surrendered. Franco established a dictatorship that would last until his passing in 1975. By the early 1900s, Mexico was controlled by a single man, Porfirio Diaz. He had ruled for more than 30 years, modernizing the country but keeping power in the hands of the wealthy elite. Most Mexicans, especially farmers and laborers, remained poor, landless, and politically voiceless. Foreign investors dominated industries, while indigenous communities lost their lands. In 1910, when Diaz rigged an election to stay in power, the country exploded into revolution. Francisco Madero, a wealthy reformer, called for an uprising. His message inspired revolutionary leaders like Emilio Zapata in the South and Pancho Villa in the North, who led armed groups demanding land reforms and workers' rights. By 1911, Diaz was forced to resign and flee to Europe. Madero became president, but his rule was short-lived. In 1913, military general Victoriano Huerta overthrew Madero and had him removed from power. Outraged, revolutionaries across the country took up arms again. Zapata's forces seized lands from wealthy landowners, while Villa's army launched daring raids, even crossing into the United States. Fierce battles erupted across Mexico, with towns changing hands multiple times. The conflict became a brutal struggle, with mass executions, burned villages, and widespread hunger. As the war waged on, Mexico's leadership changed hands multiple times. The United States intervened in 1914, sending troops to occupy Veracruz, citing concerns over foreign investments and regional stability. By 1917, a new constitution was drafted, promising land distribution, labor rights, and limits on foreign ownership. But the violence didn't end. Rival leaders continued fighting, and both Zapata and Villa were assassinated in the years that followed. By the 1920s, the revolution had reshaped Mexico. Land reforms weakened large estates, workers gained new rights, and the government took control of natural resources. Cuba in the 1950s was a nation of extremes. Havana was a playground for the wealthy, filled with luxury hotels, casinos, and nightclubs, while rural areas suffered from deep poverty. Most of the economy was controlled by foreign corporations, and political power rested in the hands of Fulgencio Batista, a military dictator who had seized control in a 1952 coup. Using censorship, imprisonment, and secret police, Batista crushed opposition. But resentment was growing, and a young lawyer named Fidel Castro was about to lead the fight for change. In 1953, Castro and a small group of rebels attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, hoping to spark an uprising. The plan failed. Most of the attackers were captured, and Castro was sentenced to prison. But instead of fading into obscurity, he used his trial to publicly condemn Batista's rule. He was sentenced to 15 years, but released after 2. Exiled in Mexico, Castro met Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine revolutionary. Together, they trained a small guerrilla force, and in 1956 sailed back to Cuba aboard a tiny yacht carrying 82 rebels. Most didn't survive or were captured, but Castro and Guevara and a handful of survivors escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, launching a guerrilla war. Farmers and laborers, fed up with corruption and economic hardship, began to rally behind them. By 1958, Batista's regime was crumbling. His army suffered repeated defeats, and desertions skyrocketed. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and Castro's forces entered Havana victorious. The revolution transformed Cuba overnight. Castro nationalized industries, redistributed land, and aligned with the Soviet Union, setting the stage for decades of Cold War tensions. In 1975, after years of civil war, a radical communist group called the Khmer Rouge marched into Cambodia's capital. Their leader, Pol Pot, promised a new society where everyone would be equal. Instead, his rule led to one of the deadliest social experiments in history. Over the next 4 years, millions of Cambodians were displaced, forced into labor camps, or lost their lives. Pol Pot's vision was extreme. He wanted to turn Cambodia into a self-sufficient agrarian society, free from foreign influence and modern technology. Within days of taking power, the Khmer Rouge emptied entire cities, forcing people into the countryside. Hospitals, schools, and factories were abandoned. People were forced to destroy books, art, and anything tied to the old way of life. Doctors, teachers, and anyone else seen as educated were targeted. Even wearing glasses was considered a sign of intelligence and put people at risk. Daily life under the Khmer Rouge was brutal. People were forced to work in the fields for long hours with little food. Starvation and disease spread rapidly. Families were separated and individual identity was erased. Money, religion, and private property were outlawed. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was sent to prison, where few made it out alive. By 1979, the Khmer Rouge collapsed. Vietnam invaded Cambodia and overthrew Pol Pot's regime after years of border conflicts. By then, nearly 2 million Cambodians, 1/4 of the population, were gone. By the late 1800s, China was carved up by foreign powers. Western nations, Japan and Russia controlled trade, ran ports, and imposed unequal treaties on the weakened Qing dynasty. Many Chinese resented the growing foreign influence, blaming it for economic struggles, corruption, and the erosion of traditional values. Tensions boiled over in 1899, when a secret society known as the Boxers began a violent uprising to drive out all foreigners. The Boxers, officially called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, believed they had supernatural powers that made them immune to bullets. They practiced martial arts and rituals, convinced they could summon spirits to protect them. Their slogan was simple: support the Qing, destroy the foreigner. At first, they targeted Christian missionaries and Chinese converts who they saw as traitors. By the mid-1900s, the movement had spread across northern China, with thousands of Boxers attacking foreign settlements, destroying railroads, and cutting telegraph lines. Foreigners and Chinese Christians fled to Beijing's legation quarter, a walled-off area where diplomats lived. In June 1900, the Boxers laid siege to the legation quarter. trapping over 400 foreigners and thousands of Chinese Christians inside. The Qing government, led by Empress Dowager Cixi, saw an opportunity and declared war on all foreign nations in China. Foreign embassies were under attack, and foreign soldiers, traders, and missionaries were eliminated. The response was swift. An 8-nation alliance, including Britain, the US, Germany, Russia, Japan, and France, sent 20,000 troops to crush the uprising. By August, they fought their way into Beijing, lifting the siege after 55 days. The Boxers were no match for modern weapons. By the 1640s, England was on the brink of collapse. King Charles I ruled as if he had absolute power, dismissing Parliament and raising taxes without approval. His policies angered nobles, commoners, and especially Puritans, who opposed his religious reforms. When Charles tried to arrest his critics in 1642, the country erupted into war. The conflict divided England. On one side were the Royalists, Cavaliers, who supported the king. On the other were the Parliamentarians, Roundheads, who wanted to limit his power. At first, the war seemed even, but a new army changed everything. In 1645, Parliament created the New Model Army, led by Oliver Cromwell. Highly disciplined and motivated by religious zeal, they began defeating the king's forces in battle after battle. By 1646, Charles was captured, but he refused to compromise. He escaped, started a second war, and was defeated again. This time, Parliament had had enough. Charles was put on trial for treason, the first time in history a sitting monarch had been held accountable by his people. After weeks of proceedings, he was found guilty and sentenced to execution. On January 30th, 1649, Charles was publicly hanged outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. For the first time, England became a republic, ruled by Cromwell as Lord Protector. The monarchy was gone, but Cromwell's rule was far from democratic. Thank you for watching the video and making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something. Comment down below on what types of videos you'd like to see next. We're making new videos all the time and are interested in what you want to see. Thanks again. See you next time.